It is the 14th of April, 1945, and along the banks of the River Ruhr, a strange silence has settled over what was once one of the most fearsome armies in the world. In the town of Hattingen, American soldiers of the First and Ninth Armies are shaking hands across a river they have just used to cut a trapped German force clean in two. Around them, in cellars and farmhouses and shattered factory yards, tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers are doing something their training, their oaths, and their propaganda told them was unthinkable. They are giving up. Not in ones and twos, not as isolated stragglers slipping away from the fight, but in whole companies, whole regiments, entire divisions, walking towards Allied lines with hands raised and white cloth tied to their rifles. Some have not eaten properly in days. Some carry a small printed leaflet, folded and refolded so many times the creases have worn through, promising decent treatment if they hand themselves over. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding what remains of Army Group B, cannot bring himself to sign the surrender himself. He simply dissolves his own command and lets his men do what he will not. Within days, more than 300,000 German soldiers will pass into Allied captivity from this pocket alone, the single largest capitulation of a German field army in the West during the entire war. What makes this moment so striking is not that Germany was losing. By April 1945, that was obvious to almost everyone, soldier and civilian alike. What makes it striking is how the war was ending for so many of these men. Barely a fortnight's journey to the east, on the plains before Berlin and along the Oder, German soldiers were dying in their tens of thousands rather than accept capture, fighting with a desperation that bordered on the suicidal. In the west, along the Rhine and through the Ruhr, entire formations were surrendering with scarcely a shot fired, sometimes to the visible frustration of the American and British soldiers accepting them, who found there were not enough guards, not enough trucks, and not enough paperwork to process the flood. One account from the period recalls that a German soldier might walk for miles before finding an Allied serviceman not too busy with other duties to bother accepting his surrender. This was not a single dramatic collapse. It was the culmination of months, in places years, of a slow unraveling that had turned one of history's most disciplined fighting forces into an army whose soldiers, in the West at least, increasingly wanted nothing more than to be taken prisoner. This was not the first such collapse the Western Allies had witnessed, only the largest. The previous summer, in the fields around Falaise in Normandy, tens of thousands of German soldiers had already discovered what it meant to be caught inside a closing pocket with no fuel, no air cover, and no route home, and many of those who survived the slaughter of the Falaise Gap chose surrender over a hopeless breakout. By the fourth winter of the war, this pattern had repeated itself often enough at the Channel ports, along the Siegfried Line, in the shattered towns east of the Rhine, that it had almost become routine, a grim rhythm that Allied intelligence officers had learned to anticipate and, in time, to actively encourage. The scale of it, once the figures are laid side by side, becomes almost difficult to comprehend. More than 2.8 million German soldiers surrendered to the Western Allies between the Normandy landings in June 1944 and the end of April 1945. That is roughly the population of a small European country marched into captivity in under a year, and this was not evenly spread. It accelerated, snowballed, and then, in the final weeks, became something closer to a flood than a trickle. Understanding why so many men who had fought with such tenacity earlier in the war chose, in the end, to lay down their arms so readily in the West, while their comrades in the East fought on until they were killed, is not a simple story of cowardice or collapse. It is a story about fear, about calculation, about propaganda that actually worked, and about an army whose leadership had made surrender, in a strange and terrible way, the only rational choice left to the ordinary soldier. That is worth understanding properly, because it says as much about human nature under pressure as it does about the final months of the Second World War. By the fourth year of the war, The German army in the West was not merely losing battles. It was losing the ability to fight them in any coherent way, and the reasons for that went far beyond the fact that Allied tanks were rolling forward and Allied bombers filled the sky. The rot had set in gradually through a combination of catastrophic manpower losses, the destruction of Germany's industrial base, and decisions made in Berlin that consistently prioritized political symbolism over military sense. The German army had already absorbed losses on the Eastern Front that no nation, however ruthlessly it conscripted its population, could sustain indefinitely. Divisions that had once mustered 15,000 men were being scraped together from a few thousand exhausted survivors, teenage conscripts barely trained to strip a rifle, and older men pulled from jobs that Germany could ill afford to leave unfilled. The formations defending the Rhine and the Ruhr in early 1945 were, in many cases, shadows of the units whose names they still carried. Adolf Hitler's insistence on holding ground rather than conducting orderly withdrawals compounded the crisis in a way that his own generals, including Dwight Eisenhower's opposite numbers, came to see as a gift to the Allies. Time and again, German commanders who could see that a position was untenable were forbidden to retreat, forced instead to stand and be encircled. Eisenhower himself later reflected that the German dictator had, through his refusal to permit a fluid withdrawal east of the Rhine, effectively handed the Western Allies hundreds of thousands of prisoners on a plate, prisoners who might otherwise have escaped to fight again, or at least to surrender on more advantageous terms further east. The consequence was a string of pockets at Falaise in Normandy, around the Channel ports, and finally in the Ruhr itself, where German formations found themselves cut off with no realistic hope of relief, their fuel exhausted, their ammunition dwindling, and their supply line severed by an Allied air force that could strike almost anything that moved by daylight. The scraping together of these formations produced units the German army itself no longer entirely trusted. Volkssturm battalions, hastily mobilized from boys as young as 16 and men well into their 60s, were issued whatever rifles happened to be sitting in regional armories, sometimes weapons captured from half a dozen different countries over the course of the war, with no standard ammunition and often no more than a handful of rounds per man. Training, where it existed at all, might amount to a single afternoon. These were not soldiers in any meaningful sense of the word, and everyone from the generals down to the men themselves understood as much. Layered alongside them were remnants of once proud panzer and infantry divisions, veterans who had fought since Poland or the early campaigns in Russia, exhausted men whose units existed now mostly on paper, their nominal strength bearing almost no relationship to how many soldiers could actually be mustered for a parade, let alone a battle. Existing solutions, in the sense the German High Command understood them, had simply stopped working. Fanatical resistance orders, courts martial for defeatism, and the deployment of ad hoc scratch units made up of naval personnel, Luftwaffe ground crew, and teenagers from the Hitler Youth could not manufacture fuel that did not exist or replace tanks that could not be built. Germany's oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants had been battered by the Allied bombing campaign, to the point where entire panzer divisions were being abandoned, not destroyed in combat, but left where they stood because there was no petrol left to move them. Soldiers who had once been drilled to expect superior equipment and coordinated support increasingly found themselves alone, cut off from command, uncertain whether orders from Berlin bore any relationship to the reality in front of them. And, crucially, unlike their comrades facing the Red Army, the men in the West had good reason to believe that surrender would not mean death or a lifetime in a Siberian labor camp. That distinction, more than any single battlefield defeat, is the key to understanding what followed, because it meant that for the first time in years, ordinary German soldiers in the West had a genuinely rational alternative to fighting on, giving up to the Americans and British, who were widely believed, correctly as it turned out, to treat their prisoners according to something resembling civilized rules. The organization most responsible for turning that belief into a documented, repeatable choice was the Psychological Warfare Division of Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, universally known by its acronym SHAEF, working in close partnership with British and American propaganda specialists and the United States Office of War Information. Early in the war, surrender leaflets dropped on German troops had been a haphazard affair. The British, the French, and the Soviets had all produced their own versions, printed in different sizes and colors, carrying different instructions, with no consistency at all. A German soldier encountering one leaflet one week and a completely different design the next had little reason to trust any of them. What the combined Anglo-American planning teams did, once the United States entered the European theater in force, was standardize the entire approach into a single, unmistakable document known to German soldiers as the Passierschein, or Safe Conduct Pass. The design itself was a masterclass in applied psychology rather than raw firepower, and it is worth pausing on how deliberately it was constructed. Analysts working for the Allies had studied captured German prisoners and concluded, somewhat counterintuitively, that ordinary German soldiers, even in the chaos of a collapsing front, retained a deep cultural respect for official-looking paperwork. So, instead of a crude propaganda flyer, the Allies produced something closer to a legal document, printed on decent stock, engraved in a style one veteran compared to a share certificate or university diploma, carrying the Great Seal of the United States alongside the British Royal Crest, and bearing the printed signature of General Eisenhower himself. The text, printed in both German and English so that no soldier could doubt what he was reading, instructed any Allied frontline soldier receiving it to treat the bearer well, disarm him, feed him, provide medical care if required, and remove him from the danger zone as quickly as possible. On the reverse, later versions quoted relevant passages from the Hague and Geneva Conventions, printed in the Gothic-style lettering German bureaucratic documents traditionally used, reinforcing the sense that this was not enemy trickery but something with the weight of international law behind it. These leaflets were manufactured on a genuinely industrial scale. Over the course of the campaign in Northwest Europe, more than 65 million copies of the standard Safe Conduct Pass, coded ZG-61 in Allied production records, were printed and distributed, dropped from aircraft in their hundreds of millions across the whole spectrum of Allied propaganda material, and fired directly onto the battlefield packed into artillery shells designed for the purpose, a technique that let commanders place surrender instructions almost literally in a soldier's foxhole within minutes of a unit deciding it wanted to give up. Mobile printing units, built around workhorse duplicator presses mounted in specially equipped trucks, followed the advancing armies so that leaflets could be updated and reprinted based on feedback gathered directly from prisoner interrogations, a level of iterative refinement that would not look out of place in a modern marketing campaign. By December 1944, the Psychological Warfare Division had become so protective of the pass's authority that it formally forbade individual units from producing their own versions, insisting that only the official chef-issued document should circulate, on the theory that a flood of competing designs would dilute the credibility that made the whole thing work in the first place. The refinement process behind the pass is, in its own quiet way, as impressive as the document itself. Early versions carried the English text above the German, a choice that struck some captured soldiers as suspicious, as though the document had been designed primarily for an American audience and merely translated as an afterthought. Interrogators fed this feedback back up the chain, and later print runs reversed the layout, placing the German text uppermost and adding a printed note confirming that both languages carried an identical message, a small adjustment but one that measurably increased soldiers' willingness to trust what they were reading. Eisenhower's printed name was, at one stage, replaced with an actual facsimile of his signature, because interrogators discovered that many German soldiers did not recognize his printed name as sufficiently official, but did respond to something that looked like a genuine autograph. Color, too, was tested and adjusted. Several tints were tried before red was settled upon as the version that stood out most reliably against mud, stubble, and forest floor, a seemingly trivial detail that mattered enormously to a design intended to be found and read within seconds by an exhausted man under fire. none of this was guesswork. It was closer to a continuous product trial being run in the middle of a war, refined week by week against real feedback gathered from real prisoners. The results, once the interrogation reports began coming back through Allied lines, told their own story with startling clarity. By October 1944, official assessments found that 77% of prisoners taken by the Allies had read at least one Allied leaflet, and on the Brest Peninsula, that figure rose to roughly 80% of captured men carrying one on their person. There are accounts, impossible to verify in every detail but consistent across multiple sources, of a German soldiers surrendering in small groups sharing a single leaflet between them, each man clutching a corner of the same worn scrap of paper as though it were a passport rather than propaganda, one hand raised, the other refusing to let go of the document that might save his life. In one especially telling episode, 44 men from a single Volksgrenadier division deserted together to an American unit, nearly all of them carrying the Safe Conduct Pass, a piece of paper that had done more to end their war than any weapon fired against them. The methods of delivery evolved to match the shifting shape of the front. Where the ground war moved fastest, aircraft dropped leaflets in their millions along likely retreat routes and around towns known to be sheltering retreating units. Where the front was static, or where a pocket had formed and Allied commanders wanted the message placed with precision rather than scattered by wind, artillery did the job instead. Ordinary shells packed with leaflets rather than explosive, timed to burst overhead and scatter their paper cargo directly onto the German positions below. It was, in its way, an oddly gentle use of ordnance built for killing, and soldiers who found these leaflets sometimes described them as arriving scorched or crumpled from the blast, edges singed by the very charge that had delivered them, a small irony that seemed to underline the strangeness of the whole endeavor. Radio broadcasts aimed at German units by mobile Allied stations reinforced the printed message, reading out the same assurances of decent treatment and reminding listeners where the nearest safe conduct passes could be found among the leaflets already scattered across their sector. The port towns of Brittany, cut off from the main German retreat in the late summer of 1944, provide one of the clearer illustrations of how thoroughly the leaflets had penetrated German ranks by that stage of the war. Garrisons besieged in Brest and the surrounding peninsula, holding out under direct orders from Berlin to deny the Allies use of the harbor for as long as possible, nonetheless surrendered in such numbers, and with such a high proportion of men carrying the pass on their person, that Allied assessors used the peninsula as a case study in just how deeply the propaganda campaign had taken hold. Aachen, the first German city to fall to the Western Allies in October 1944, saw a defense that was, in places, fierce and costly, yet even there significant numbers of the garrison chose to give themselves up once resistance had clearly become hopeless rather than fight to the last building, a pattern that would repeat itself with growing frequency as the front moved deeper into Germany proper. By the time American forces seized the Ludendorff railway bridge at Remagen intact in March 1945, an event that stunned commanders on both sides and opened the Rhine crossing weeks ahead of schedule, the psychological effect on German units nearby was almost immediate. Formations that had been told the Rhine represented Germany's last true defensive barrier now watched Allied armor pour across a bridge nobody had planned to lose, and surrender rates in the surrounding sector climbed sharply within days, according to intelligence summaries compiled at the time. It is difficult to separate, in moments like these, how much of the collapse in morale came from material despair at the military situation, and how much came from the accumulated effect of months of leaflets telling German soldiers, correctly as they were discovering, that captivity under the Western Allies was survivable, orderly, and nowhere near as fearsome as the alternative. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap of a button. There is a great deal more to this story, in what actually happened when these tens of thousands of men reached the wire, and in how strikingly different their war ended compared with the men fighting a few hundred kilometers to the east. So if that sounds like your kind of history, sticking around is very much worth your while. The practical use of all this on the ground played out across dozens of separate collapses rather than one single dramatic surrender, and the pattern repeats itself with almost eerie consistency. In Normandy, during the summer of 1944, the numbers started slowly, only around 4,000 prisoners taken by the 9th of June, rising to some 15,000 within a fortnight. But by the time the Falaise pocket closed in August, entire German formations that had been fighting with real determination only weeks earlier were giving themselves up en masse, contributing to a total of roughly 200,000 prisoners taken during the Normandy campaign alone. When the Allies broke out towards the German frontier in the autumn, and again when the Americans linked up with forces landing in the south of France, hundreds of thousands more soldiers found themselves cut off with no route home, and September 1944 alone accounted for well over 300,000 surrenders, one of the single largest monthly losses the German army suffered anywhere during the war. The winter months, through the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes and the hard fighting that followed, saw the pace slacken somewhat as the front stabilized and Hitler's forces briefly regained some initiative. But from March 1945 onward, the numbers accelerated in a way that reads, in the surviving intelligence summaries, almost like a countdown to collapse. Roughly 10,000 men a day were surrendering through March, a figure Eisenhower himself cited publicly when he described the Wehrmacht in the West as a whipped army. Within the first fortnight of April, that daily rate had climbed to something closer to 40,000 men a day, and in the final 10 days of the month, as the Ruhr pocket finished collapsing and the remaining German formations in the West disintegrated entirely, the rate exceeded 50,000 surrenders a day, an almost unimaginable hemorrhage of manpower crammed into a matter of weeks. Joseph Stalin, watching from Moscow, reportedly told his own commanders with something close to alarm that the German front in the West had entirely collapsed, and pressed ahead with his own assault on Berlin partly out of concern that the Western Allies were rounding up the German army too easily and too fast. What makes these figures so remarkable is not merely their size but the manner in which they were achieved. The casualties suffered by the Western Allies in extracting nearly 3 million prisoners from the German army were, relative to the scale of the achievement, strikingly light, somewhere in the region of 780,000 to 812,000 dead, wounded, and missing combined, a figure roughly equal to German losses in the same theater over the same period once prisoners are set aside. That parity is itself telling, because it means the fighting that did take place in the West was, brutal as it often was for the men caught in it, nowhere near as costly as it would have been had German units chosen to fight to destruction rather than surrender. In the battle for the Ruhr pocket specifically, something like 10,000 Germans died, a mixture of combat deaths, executions, and civilian casualties caught in the fighting, against more than 317,000 who surrendered, a ratio that stands in stark contrast to almost anything happening on the Eastern Front during the same weeks, where at the Battle of Halby alone, fought in the closing days of April as a much smaller encircled German force tried to break out towards American lines rather than fall into Soviet hands, over 30,000 German soldiers were killed in a matter of days. Not every account of these surrenders is documented in the kind of granular detail historians might wish for. Many of the individual moments, the precise words exchanged between a surrendering officer and the Allied soldier receiving him, the exact condition of the men as they emerged from cellars and forests, exist only in scattered memoirs, oral histories, and the occasional interrogation report rather than in any single comprehensive archive. What can be said with confidence, because it rests on Allied intelligence summaries compiled at the time, on newspaper reporting that was checked against official figures, and on post-war historical research drawing on both American and German military records, is the broad shape of what happened. A German army in the West that had, by the spring of 1945, largely lost both the physical means and the psychological will to keep fighting, and that increasingly regarded surrender not as a failure of duty, but as the only sensible course left open to it. The comparison with what was happening barely a few hundred kilometers away, on the Eastern Front, is where this story becomes genuinely stark, and it is impossible to understand the Western collapse without setting it against its Eastern counterpart. German soldiers facing the Red Army had every reason to believe that captivity meant a death sentence delayed rather than avoided, a belief rooted partly in propaganda but heavily reinforced by the brutal reality of conditions in Soviet camps and by the horrifying conduct of German forces on the Eastern Front themselves, conduct that made soldiers reasonably fear reprisal. The figures bear this out with grim precision. Only around 800,000 German soldiers surrendered to the Soviets in the final 3 or 4 months of the war, compared with well over 1.8 million who surrendered to the Western Allies in the same period, despite the Eastern Front absorbing by far the larger share of Germany's remaining combat strength. German military casualty records for the period, incomplete as they are, suggest that men killed or wounded in the East outnumbered those in the West by something in the order of 15 to 1 during the final weeks of the war, and in the opening 10 days of April 1945 specifically, the ratio approached 150 to 1. That is not a story of two armies fighting the same war under similar conditions. It is two entirely different calculations being made by two groups of soldiers who happen to wear the same uniform. German attempts to replicate the Allies' safe conduct pass on their own side of the propaganda war were, by comparison, almost entirely ineffective. Goebbels' propaganda apparatus did produce its own leaflets aimed at demoralizing Allied troops, and, in a handful of cases, mimicked the format of Allied surrender documents in an effort to discredit them, including one crude counterfeit that warned any German soldier who surrendered could expect 10 years in captivity and might never see his family again. But Germany, by 1944 and 1945, simply did not possess the credibility to make such promises convincing, nor the organizational capacity to distribute anything on a comparable scale, and the Allied Safe Conduct Pass was considered so effective that it prompted direct German retaliation in kind, precisely because nothing else the propaganda ministry produced was managing to slow the flow of surrenders. American efforts against Japan in the Pacific, by contrast, demonstrate just how much the German scheme depended on specific cultural assumptions that did not translate elsewhere. Early American leaflets aimed at Japanese soldiers used the word for surrender directly, only to discover that this triggered exactly the shame-based resistance the leaflets were meant to overcome. Given the powerful cultural stigma attached to capitulation under the values many Japanese servicemen were raised with, and surrenders of Japanese personnel remained comparatively rare throughout the Pacific Campaign, even as the military situation there grew equally hopeless. The German case worked, in other words, not because propaganda leaflets are universally effective, but because Allied psychological warfare planners correctly identified a specific German susceptibility: respect for officialdom, formal documentation, and internationally recognized legal process, and built a tool precisely shaped to exploit it. It is also worth setting the Western figures against Britain's own experience of mass surrender earlier in the war, if only to show how unusual the scale of the 1945 collapse really was. Roughly 41,000 British troops were taken prisoner during the retreat to Dunkirk, and a further 138,000 British and Indian soldiers surrendered at Singapore in what remains the largest capitulation in British military history. Across the entire war, in every theater combined, Britain lost some 173,000 men to captivity, and the United States around 130,000. Set against those figures, the 2.8 million German soldiers who surrendered in Northwest Europe alone, in less than a year, represent a collapse on a scale that has few genuine precedents in modern military history, achieved not through a single catastrophic defeat of the kind that produced Singapore, but through a slow, cumulative, almost administrative disintegration spread across dozens of separate fronts and hundreds of individual units. The Soviets, for their part, never adopted anything resembling the Passierschein, and had little practical need to. Red Army propaganda aimed at German troops leaned instead on class-based appeals, urging ordinary soldiers to turn against their officers and the capitalist interests supposedly directing the war. A message that found some traction among genuinely disillusioned troops but never achieved anything close to the systematic, document-driven effect the Western Allies engineered. Given how thoroughly German soldiers on the Eastern Front had already been convinced, not without justification, that Soviet captivity meant slow death through starvation, exposure, and forced labor, no amount of clever leaflet design could plausibly have overcome that fear in the way official-looking paperwork managed to overcome German soldiers' anxieties about surrendering to the British and Americans. The lasting impact of this collapse reaches well beyond the immediate battlefield arithmetic. Militarily, the sheer scale of the Western surrenders meant that by the time Germany capitulated formally in May 1945, the Western Allies were holding well over 3 million German prisoners of war in the Northwest European theater alone, a logistical challenge so enormous that improvised holding areas, essentially open fields fenced with barbed wire and given the grim nickname of Rhine Meadow Camps, well beyond anything Allied planners had budgeted for when the campaign began. Politically, the manner of the German army's collapse in the West, achieved with relatively modest Allied casualties, helped shape the post-war narrative of a war won as much through overwhelming material and organizational superiority as through raw combat, and it fed directly into Cold War tensions, since Stalin's anxiety at how easily the Western Allies appeared to be finishing off the German army in the West is documented as one of several factors sharpening his determination to reach Berlin first and to shape the peace on his own terms. Psychologically, the episode remains one of the most studied case histories in the entire field of psychological operations, cited by military planners in the decades since as proof that carefully targeted, culturally specific propaganda, backed by credible promises that are then actually honored, can achieve results that raw firepower alone cannot. The techniques pioneered by the Psychological Warfare Division, standardization of message, iterative refinement based on direct feedback from the people it was meant to influence, and above all, the insistence on truthfulness so that promises made in a leaflet were promises the receiving soldier actually experienced upon capture, became foundational doctrine for psychological operations units that followed in later conflicts, cited explicitly by American military historians studying everything from the Korean War through to more recent counterinsurgency campaigns. Surviving examples of the Passierschein itself are not especially rare. Collectors and archives, including university special collections and museum holdings dedicated to wartime propaganda, hold numerous originals, distinguishable by their small production codes and by the different colored inks used across successive print runs, most commonly a red that was found to be the most visible and recognizable when scattered across open ground or forest floor. The scale of the surrender also reshaped the immediate post-war landscape in ways that are easy to overlook. Feeding, housing, and processing more than 3 million prisoners, many of them in territory still being fought over, created a logistical burden that stretched Allied resources to their limit and forced improvisation on a grand scale, from converted French farmland fenced with little more than wire and watchtowers to former Wehrmacht barracks pressed back into service under new management. The sheer administrative weight of that many prisoners, each requiring registration, interrogation where relevant, food, and eventually repatriation, occupied Allied military government structures for months after the fighting itself had ended, and it left its own mark on how the occupation of Germany was organized in the months that followed. Historians examining prisoner mortality in these hastily built camps have debated the figures at length, and while some controversial accounts have alleged mass deaths running into the hundreds of thousands, the more carefully sourced research, drawing on individual German records rather than aggregate estimates, points to a substantially lower toll, underscoring just how contested and sensitive this corner of the story remains even 8 decades on. The broader lesson drawn by military planners in the decades since is that psychological operations of this kind work best not as isolated stunts but as sustained campaigns built on demonstrable honesty. Every safe conduct pass handed in, Every prisoner who found the promised food, medical care, and reasonably humane treatment waiting for him on the other side became in effect a piece of evidence circulating back through German ranks by word of mouth, reinforcing the credibility of the next leaflet dropped and the one after that. That feedback loop, propaganda validated by lived experience, is precisely what gave the later stages of the campaign their accelerating, almost self-sustaining momentum. And it remains, to this day, the central case study cited whenever military historians discuss the conditions under which psychological warfare can genuinely alter the course of a campaign rather than simply accompany it. What should not be lost amid the statistics and the archival detail is what this collapse actually meant in human terms for the hundreds of thousands of individual men who lived through it. Every one of those 2.8 million surrenders was a person making, often within a matter of seconds, a decision that could just as easily have gone the other way, a decision shaped by exhaustion, by hunger, by the absence of any officer left alive to give orders, and by a small folded piece of paper that told him, in his own language, that the men waiting on the other side of the field would not kill him for putting his hands in the air. It is easy looking back from a distance of 8 decades, to render all of this as inevitable, as though the collapse of the German army in the West in the spring of 1945 was always going to happen exactly as it did. It was not. It happened because a dictatorship built on the total subordination of the individual to the collective will of the state had, by its own catastrophic strategic choices, its own refusal to permit sensible retreat, its own destruction of the fuel and equipment its soldiers needed to keep fighting, made surrender the only rational choice left to an ordinary man holding a rifle in a collapsing line. And it happened, in no small part, because an alliance of British and American propagandists understood something true and specific about the psychology of the men they were fighting, and built, out of paper, ink, and a printed signature, a tool precise enough to turn that understanding into hundreds of thousands of lives spared on both sides of the wire. Return for a moment to that April morning on the banks of the Ruhr, to the sight of an entire German army group dissolving itself rather than fighting to the last man, to the hands raised not in a single dramatic gesture, but in wave after wave across an entire industrial region of Germany. Walter Model, who had commanded that army group through some of the hardest fighting of the war, chose a forest near Duisburg and a pistol over the indignity of formally surrendering to men he had spent years fighting. His soldiers made a different choice, and in doing so they revealed something his rigid, oath-bound sense of duty could not accommodate: that an army is not simply a chain of command issuing orders from the top, but hundreds of thousands of individual men, each one capable in the right circumstances of deciding for himself when the fighting has stopped meaning anything. It was not weakness alone that put those hands in the air, and it was not cowardice, whatever the propaganda of a dying regime tried to claim. It was calculation, born of hunger and exhaustion and the plain evidence of a war already lost, and it was trust, however grudging, in a promise printed on a small piece of paper that turned out, unlike almost everything else the German soldier had been told for 12 years, to be true. Where the Red Army faced men who fought until they were killed, the Western Allies faced men who had been given, and had come to believe in, an alternative. Consider what each side had actually built by the spring of 1945. The Germans had built fear, exhaustion, and a state apparatus so thoroughly discredited that even its own field marshals could no longer bring themselves to follow its final orders. The Allies had built something quieter and, in the end, far more effective: a piece of paper that told the truth, distributed by the tens of millions, backed up every single time by soldiers on the receiving end who actually delivered on what it promised. One side offered only the certainty of continued suffering. The other offered evidence, repeated often enough and honestly enough to be believed, that surrender did not have to mean disgrace or death. Given that choice, over and over, in farmhouses and forests and factory towns across the length of Western Germany, millions of ordinary men chose to live. 300,000 men surrendered in the Ruhr alone. 2.8 million surrendered across the whole of the campaign in the West. Behind every one of those numbers sits a single human being weighing a single choice, weighing hunger against duty, fear of the unknown against the plain evidence in front of him, and choosing, in the end, to live. That is the story of how one of the most formidable armies the world had ever seen came apart, not simply through defeat in battle, but through the quiet, cumulative power of an army's own soldiers deciding, one folded leaflet at a time, that the war was already over. It ended not with a final stand, but with hands raised, papers clutched, and an entire ideology's promise of fanatical resistance dissolving, division by division, into silence.